Calls Commissioner Morath.
Thank you, Chairman Meyer. Thank you, representatives, committee members. My name is Mike Morath, Commissioner of the Texas Education Agency. In front of you, you have a PowerPoint deck that I'm going to walk through slide by slide with you, hopefully efficiently in a way that is not boring. So I'll start at the beginning. This is a brief history of tax relief of relevance to the school finance system passed by the Texas legislature. So going back to 1997, prior to that, the statewide homestead exemption was $5,000. It was raised to $15,000 then. And of course, what that did was provide tax relief to homeowners that have a homestead exemption. It also reduced the amount of revenue coming in from property taxes to fund, among other things, the school finance system. House Bill 1, 2006. In this case, you saw a rate compression. Prior to that, the maximum M&O rate in the state was $1.50 for the system. It changed to $1 and was bifurcated between Tier 1 and Tier 2. So by local action, school boards could add up to 17 cents of additional taxes, and then local school boards can adopt a Tier 1 rate up to $1, and it's their choice whether they want to go all the way to $1 or less. In 2015, the homestead exemption was increased another $10,000 with Senate Bill 1. Then in House Bill 3, this created the automatic rate compression statewide based upon appraisal increases. So prior to this, any amount of appraisal increases resulted in the same underlying tax rate was given to much higher appraisal increases that increased property tax collections mightily over time, which was used as a funding source for public education. But public education is funded on a mix of property taxes and state revenues. So what that essentially did was it didn't cause more money for school districts. It caused a shift in funding source steadily away from state revenues to property taxes. So in House Bill 3, you created a structural mechanism to stop that, to keep the balance between state and local, but you still allow 2.5% of appraisal increases to be caused as an additional funding source for public education. And so there's been a lot of automatic rate compression since then, but that doesn't mean no new property tax revenue, because the first 2.5% is in fact new property tax revenue and therefore new tax payments from property tax owners. That also set up a bifurcated mechanism, so there's an automatic compression based upon any value growth above 2.5% statewide. If you are in a local school district, so we are sitting in Austin ISD's boundaries, and your property values are growing by more than the state, then you get faster rate compression. But in order to maintain the constitutional requirement to have a roughly equivalent level of taxation for school funding, there was what are referred to as compression rate bands imposed. It was a 10% band. So that allows faster rate compression until you get 10% below the state, and then you're still back at the state's rate compression. So anyways, that's 2019. Then in 2021, Senate Bill 1 was passed, which took the homestead exemption from $25,000 to $40,000. And then Senate Bill 2 was a significant amount of rate compression compared with a significant increase in the homestead exemption. So that is a sort of brief narrative history, and now we're going to go over that same thing in chart form. So slide 3 gives you a picture of value growth used to fund the school finance system. So to some extent, this mirrors data that you got from the comptroller of underlying value growth of property values writ large in the state of Texas. That's not the same thing as funding growth for public education writ large, because of the combination of property taxes and then state revenues that fund school systems. But this is what was appraisable and how much value was used. And when you pass a homestead exemption, it essentially removes value from what is appraisable. That's different than rate compression, which just of the appraised value taxes it at a lower level. So what you see there is the sort of cumulative, the little orange is the cumulative effect of how much value has been removed from the cumulative increases from the homestead exemption since about the last decade. Slide 4 is very information dense, has a lot of this information all on one slide. So the line is the average M&O rate charged to taxpayers, property owners in the state of Texas. You can see it was $1.50 before the big rate compression in 2005-ish. It steadily teetered up from $1 to $1.06 or something like that as more and more school districts adopted Tier 2 tax rates. That sort of rose the average. Then House Bill 3 kicks in, and you can see the automatic compression of Tier 1 happening. Then you have the huge compression in 2023 on top of the automatic compression that happens. One thing to point out is you'll notice the blue bar is the amount of property taxes that fund public education, which has steadily gone up other than the huge rate compression in 2007. Even steadily went up during the Great Recession. Actually, I guess it was flat. Because of the rate compression that you passed in Senate Bill 2, combined with the homestead exemptions of Senate Bill 2, you actually saw significant reduction in total tax payments, not just a reduction in increased tax payments, because virtually everything that you did before that reduced the increases. So you had real tax reduction from Senate Bill 2. The purple just shows you how much property taxpayers would be paying into the system had you not taken the combined actions of Senate Bill 2, the most recent session, Senate Bill 1 in between, and House Bill 3 back in 2019. So
hold on real quick before we move on to slide 5. So on slide 4, the ISD M&O taxes, if I'm reading this correctly, are $18.9 billion less than they would have been without the legislature cutting the taxes last session.
That's exactly right.
Okay,
yeah.
Very good. Thanks, sir.
So as someone who owns property, thank you. So slide 5 shows another view of that same tax relief. This is really just the tax relief provided to property owners through those 3 bills in particular since 2019. So you've got tax compression as part of that. That's the House Bill 3 automated compression, and then you've got the $10,000 increase in the homestead exemption, then the $60,000 increase in homestead exemption, 10 or 15,000. So those are the homestead exemption increases. So slide 6 is now looking at property tax payments for public education writ large. It is sort of a school finance 101. You have Tier 1, you have the enrichment pennies, and then you have INS. The taxpayers don't actually know the difference. You just pay one bill to your appraisal district, to your school district. But from a school district perspective, those are 3 different funding streams with 3 different allowable uses. And so you can see what has been the history of the Tier 1 collections. And that big decline in Tier 1 collections from 23 to 24 is really the result of the Senate Bill 2 compression the most recent year. You'll notice no real change in enrichment property tax payments. In fact, those have been steadily increasing as more and more school districts are using more and more of their Tier 2 pennies, the 17 pennies. Sometimes you'll hear that referred to as golden and copper pennies. And then INS has just steadily been increasing. So this is local school boards going to their local voters saying, we would like to increase our tax collections from you for the purposes of paying debt for buildings. That's what that's really for. And that's generally continued. So as you look at the picture of property tax payments, it's just important to remember part of that in the school finance system is for the Tier 1 entitlement. Part of that is for Tier 2 enrichment, and part of that is for debt service for buildings. So slide 7 gives you a picture just of the debt service. So this is the total outstanding indebtedness of public schools across the state of Texas. You can see the growth in total debt load. This is the value of all outstanding bonds issued by ISDs writ large. So local ISDs go to their voters, they set their rates. There's a provision where you can't really go to more than 50 cents worth of taxes for debt, but anything underneath that, it's up to the school district to figure out what they want to do and the voters to approve it. There's a high degree of variability in INS levels. You see that on slide 8. So you've got places in Texas that have literally 0 taxes imposed on their voters for debt. Maybe they haven't built a school building in 30 years, and they handle all of the school building maintenance from their core operational budget. That is more common in rural Texas than it is anywhere else. It is certainly not the case in any place that's been fast growing. They definitely have school debt for building school buildings. And you can see the range of debt there. I mentioned before there's about a 50-cent cap on that, but you'll notice it actually goes above that. There are some exceptions to that cap for a variety of reasons, but it's pretty rare. So now let me talk about the Foundation School Program. When you think about the budgetary picture of the legislature and what your cost of public education is, your state level cost of public education is different than the total cost of public education. The total cost of public education is driven by the entitlement that the legislature authorizes. Every kid in Texas is worth, $10,500 a kid on average of M&O, and then INS is on top of that. If you increase entitlement, that increases district budgets. If you decrease entitlement, that reduces district budgets. If more kids show up in a district, it increases a district's budget. If less kids show up in a district, it decreases a district's budget. But the first money in is always property taxes. And so the amount of money the state has to spend to fund that total entitlement is directly interrelated to the amount of property values that are coming into the system. But it is wise, I think, for policymakers to understand what is the total cost of the system, because these are all sort of interrelated variables. The total cost of the system is largely going to be driven by what is your entitlement set on a per pupil basis and the way the formulas work, and then how many kids you have. That's what your total cost is. And so one thing to bear in mind is that enrollment, which has been growing historically at a very rapid clip, 50,000 kids a year show up newly in Texas public schools, and that was true for 2 decades, stopped being true in 2019. I don't know what color that is. It's like a light green color on slide 10, that bar. That is the total enrolled student population in Texas, which peaked at about 5.5 million kids. You can see there was a big dip in 2021 as a lot of kids left public education during COVID. Most of those kids are back, but the population is not growing anymore. It's still at about 5.5 million kids. It's also a function not just of total enrollment, but we pay school districts in part based on do the kids show up each day, average daily attendance. And so one thing that has also been true is kids attend school at a slightly lower rate than they used to. There's a broad shift. This is not limited just to Texas. This is a countrywide phenomenon. So you see about a 1% lower rate of school attendance today than you did pre-COVID. There's a variety of hypotheses as to why that is true, but what that generally means is that all things being equal, you're spending about $380 million less on public education due to slightly lower attendance rates than you used to, even for the same number of kids. When you are thinking from a tax policy perspective and projecting out over the next decade, I want to come back to these demographic factors. So look at slide 11. Even though, as Comptroller Hager mentioned, we had 1,200 new residents a day in the state of Texas, they are not really coming with children. The total number of 4-year-olds system-wide, statewide, according to the state demographer, is about 40,000 kids fewer than just a few years ago. So this has been basically a decline in birth rates. That happened after the Great Recession. It happened with COVID. And that is working its way through public education in the state of Texas, and this is a countrywide phenomenon. So as you're thinking about total state spending, as you're thinking about total spending on public education, for the next several years, and you see that on slide 12, we are actually not projecting an increase in the total student population. And this is a very new phenomenon, I think, for appropriators and for tax policymakers in Texas, because that, again, was not true for the last 2 decades in Texas. So just want to point out the sort of key drivers of the Foundation School Program. We're not seeing population growth in the 5 to 18-year-old population. It's not just that they are leaving public school and, say, doing homeschool or private school. There's just literally fewer children per adults in Texas than there used to be. So what this means is when you're projecting out the overall cost of the Foundation School Program over the next decade, slide 13 gives you a sort of an illustrative example. For the, say, 10 years up to today, total Foundation School Program costs, so this is state budget cost, this is local property tax cost, all in. It was growing by about 3.5% per year. For the next 10 years, we were projected to grow more like 2% per year. And that is not necessarily because new kids are showing up in the system. It's because the state law for funding entitlement for school districts also has automatic increases in funding built in. This is not well understood, but Tier 2 is indexed to an inflationary measure, so there's automatic increases in entitlement. You have programs like the teacher incentive allotment that cause significant inflows of funding to school districts for teachers, and there's a few similar things that just automatically increase funding to school districts. So that's what you're seeing, not necessarily population growth driving the total foundation school program costs. So let me shift gears and talk about tax policy changes. One of your charges is to consider, can we do additional tax relief? How much does that cost? How does that impact? So again, one thing to bear in mind is in terms of the total cost of the foundation school program, you don't have significant drivers increasing the total cost of the foundation school program. So that's one slightly reduced variable than what you normally have to consider. So we went ahead and modeled 3 different policy options just to give you a sense of what it costs on a per year basis. These are all, by the way, per year numbers, not biennial numbers. I know that from a budgetary perspective, but we think about foundation school program annually. So if you did 10 more pennies of compression, so can't remember exactly where we're at right now. Is it like 70 cents, 60 some cents? So we're about in the 60 to 70 cent range right now. If you did 10 more pennies, you bring it in the 50 to 60 cent range. That's $4.2 billion per year of additional state funding that you would spend to offset the reduced property taxes, and then you would continue to fund school districts at the same level. So that's what 10 more pennies of property tax compression would cost you. You could also increase the homestead exemption again. So what is another $60,000 increase in the homestead exemption cost you? That's $3 billion per year. So if you did both, just put both of those numbers together. The other thing that I think is important for you to understand, and this gets super nuanced, is the effect of the local optional homestead exemption in the school finance system. So you have a lot of jurisdictions around the state where you've got your state base $100,000 homestead exemption, and then local school boards have chosen, sometimes local cities and counties choose to do the same thing, to do up to another 20% homestead exemption. And at 20% is different than a raw dollar value. 20% on $1 million house is $200,000. So if you wanted to bring everybody up to have that common homestead exemption in the school finance system, that would cost you about $2.5 billion a year. And there is a reason why I'm telling you that I'll explain in just a minute, because there's some best way to describe it is weirdness in the school finance system that is creating disequities because of the local homestead exemption. So I'll tell you about that right now. It's on the next slide. So slide 16, school boards can provide by a motion of their own, they can provide a local optional homestead exemption of another 20% on top of all of the other homestead exemptions. Right now, 199 of the roughly 1,000 ISDs have one of those, and most of them adopt a homestead exemption at the 20%. They can structure it any number of ways, and $5,000, $10,000, anything underneath 20%. The thing about that is if you are a recapture district, when you offer that local optional homestead exemption to your school district, what we do is we reduce your recapture payments as a funding source for what you did not collect due to the LOHI. But if you are not a recapture district, that is not a funding source. And so what you have is a situation where School Board A and School Board B are faced with a question: do I adopt a LOHI or not? School Board A is a recapture district, School Board B is not a recapture district. School Board B, if they decide to do a LOHI, they just reduce their budget. And so it's a classic policymaker question: do I want to lower taxes for my taxpayers and as a result lower my own budget? Which is the same question that cities and counties face when they're considering whether to do a LOHI. But in School District A that pays recapture, why wouldn't the school board adopt this? Because their budget's not reduced. They just gave additional tax relief to their taxpayers. And so, so that is a sort of a disequity that is now in the school finance system that affects the budget of districts in ways that affects policymaking decisions of school board members around the state. So I just want to make sure you know that's a thing, and whether or not you want to do something about that. So on the last slide, there are, I think, given all of these things, there's three things that are at least top of mind for us as policymaking considerations. These are just things to consider. Whether or not you would want to do them is a different question. One, the automated compression mechanism in House Bill 3 from 2019 allows taxes to go up by 2.5% before compression kicks in. Now that controls increases, but if you didn't want any increases, you'd bring that 2.5% down to zero. And so would you want to do something with that House Bill 3 structure to preserve total tax payments, where right now you allow total tax payments to go up by 2.5% for the purposes of school finance? And I think, again, the consideration to bear in mind there is now you have a kind of a different demographic environment, sort of different longer-term costs. You can adopt that in any number of ways if you want to do that. You can actually make it variable. So it's one of those things where you look at the economic conditions for the next 2 years and make it variable. Right now it's hard-coded in statute at 2.5%. Another thing is, and there were some questions, I think, Chair Turner, your question is related to consideration number 2. It's in part related to question number 2. You have a complex situation going on in Tarrant County. When House Bill 3 was passed, that automated compression mechanism was based on the best data that we had at the time, which is the comptroller's estimates that they have from the comptroller estimates. Well, in the last couple of years, the estimates have been much lower than the actual value growth. And so we provided rate compression automatically based upon projections of value growth that were, say, 5%. But actual value growth was, say, 17%. So we lowered everybody's tax rates. And all things being equal, if your appraised value goes up but your tax rates go down, your tax bill doesn't change. And this was designed to make sure that there wasn't significant increases in tax payments. But if appraised values go up a lot faster than we estimate, we will still lower your tax rates. We just won't lower your tax rates based upon the actuals. We'll lower them based upon the estimates. So you have been delivering less tax relief than anticipated because our values grew so much more than the estimates. Since House Bill 3 was passed, the comptroller and us have worked together and created a new data collection that is closer to the actuals. But statute still requires us to use the original number as our estimate. If statute changes and it requires us to use that value that's closer to the actuals, your automatic rate compression in House Bill 3 is going to work better. And as a result, the total tax payments of your taxpayers is going to maintain closer to what you anticipated and intended with House Bill 3. So that's something else, and that requires even more explanation than I gave, but that's a thing. And then the last one is, remember that 10% equity band. You've got a whole bunch of districts that are already at the floor of the equity band. It's like north of 500 districts, and they just stay at that floor, which means they're not going to get rate compression at the same rate that values are growing. The 10% is not necessarily a magic number, so would you want to change that? This is a different 10% than Member Johnson was referring to earlier. This is the sort of equity band, but would you want to adjust those too? So I think those are three considerations we thought should be top of mind for policymakers. Representative Turner, your question about the value study is a potentially a fourth consideration that I think is worthy of some discussion as to how can you improve the tooling that school districts have to ensure that the appraised value is accurate, and then they still make their entitlement even if appraised values are lower in their area. We have a variety of thoughts. I don't think any of them are perfect, but we have a variety of thoughts we're happy to share with you on that. So with that, members, thank you for your time. I'm happy to take any questions.
Chair recognizes Representative Raymond.
Thank you, Chairman. I wanted to jump back, Commissioner, to page 10. You said you had a hypothesis about the increase in non-attendance. So you want to give you a chance to share that with us?
Sure. Well, let me caveat this with these are completely untestable hypotheses. So this is these are hot sports opinions.
Let me do a second question now while you're formulating your answer to the first one. What is your hypothesis based upon?
Yeah. I would say it's based upon a lot of discussions with a lot of educators around the state. And there's probably two factors that seem to be what most people's opinion has coalesced around. Again, untestable hypotheses. But essentially, both of them come down to a culture change that happened post-COVID. One, school is seemingly less important. So daily attendance is just broadly less important. You turn off school for a year, it's bound to have some effect on a broad basis. And two, people are reacting to sniffles with a little bit more stay at home than they used to. Both of those are what I would say, and these are broad cultural factors that have happened countrywide, which means that they are hard to change. So one, as the sort of consequences, what should y'all think about this? One thing to consider is, would you want to adjust the school finance formulas a little bit so that the school districts, which used to get about $380 million more per year for the same number of kids, if that would come up a little bit, to give them that and just adjust to the new normal. There are other things to think through, which is we got to get kids in school. We do know that when they're not at home, they don't learn as much. COVID proved that. And so we think that sort of attendance recovery efforts, attendance recovery tools are particularly important. Some of that's happening with sort of automated tooling that can help communicate better between families and school districts. We're trying to provide those kinds of supports to school districts.
Say that a little bit more about attendance recovery tools. What would those be?
So little Mikey's absent one day. Then little Mikey's absent 2 days in a row. At 2 days in a row, we should probably start doing something about that. Has anybody called mom? Has there been at least a text message to mom? Does somebody at the school, does the teacher, does the counselor know that little Mikey's been absent 2 days in a row? Can we like do some outreach to the family to find out what's going on? How do we get him back in school? Those are sort of attendance recovery efforts.
And so what are the raw numbers in terms of how many students, what the increase in non-attendance has meant in terms of the number of students?
This is a broad number across all 5.5 million kids. So it's an average of a 1% decline in attendance rates. So over 175 days, that's 1.7 fewer days of school on average for every kid in Texas. It doesn't shake out like that. There's essentially been an increase in chronic absenteeism that's driving some of the average ADA numbers down. So they shake out the way almost every pattern shakes out. So they're the most at-risk kids tend to be out of school the most.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Chair Button.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Commissioner, earlier you mentioned about even Texas, we have a growing population, but for the student population, it's not growing because just the demographic changes.
That's correct.
And since you originally came from the Dallas area, so I know you know the surrounding area very, very well, the entire North Texas. You know my district, for example, like the Richardson School District, is a kind of an aging neighborhood, okay? And recently we have to close out 5 schools, and it happened to be one of the schools in my district. And after talking to the superintendent, also they disclose on the website, it's because they have even right now they have more than 9,000 empty seats, and they estimate that soon will be like 12,000 empty seats. They estimated it. Okay, so when things like that, your agency don't have anything to do with deciding to close out. It's all the school board's decision. Is that correct?
That's correct. This is a local decision made by local administration and ratified by local school boards.
Okay. So my next question is there anything to do with that the we did not increase the student allotment, so we have to close out the school. Oh, it's basically because just the empty seats. You cannot leave the school open with empty seats and waste so much taxpayers' money. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, the school finance system is based upon an entitlement per child. So obviously it's a general policy-making question as to how much do you want to fund on a per-child basis. But when there's no children that show up, there's no money, and it doesn't matter how much is in the school finance system. It's predicated on the presence of children in school. So we have seen this has been a trend. It started in the urban core. So you think about urban Dallas, urban Austin, urban San Antonio, urban Houston. There's been a general decline in the total student population, and it is sort of spreading to the sort of inner ring suburbs. So you think Richardson ISD, and there's just not as many kids in that area as there used to be. As a result, there's not as many kids that show up in a school building as there used to be, and then that sets up a very difficult decision for local school boards to make. That, from my perspective, because we had to do this while I was a school board member in Dallas.
That's right. I remember you actually served on the school board as a president for DISD.
I wasn't the president, but I was on the board for 4.5 years, and we did have to vote to close schools.
Long time. Yeah, I remember.
It is based essentially on enrollment decisions, and to some extent, this is about resources for children. If you have 250 children in a school building, you still have a principal, you still have lunch costs, you still have you kind of want them to have a counselor. You want them to have access to these ancillary resources. If you have 600 children in a building, you generally can give them more supports. You can give them more services. And so these are tough decisions that local school boards make, but it is really the driving factor is how many kids are in that neighborhood going to that school. That's what the driving factor is.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Representative Howard.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to jump around a couple of your slides here, see if I can remember what I was asking about here. Let's see, this is on slide 6, where you show the projected increases in INS. Would you suggest that part of that, and you were on a school board, as was I, part of that has been the shift to try to save taxpayer dollars when we have lower interest rates to refinance, and that puts it, that puts the INS at a higher amount for a certain point in time.
Yeah, I think that could be part of it. I would say, though, that if you look at slide 7, that's about total debt loads, which is not going to be influenced by refinancing decisions in that way. So total debt loads are still clearly rising, which is probably the dominant driver. But there are some districts that take a particularly aggressive payoff philosophy, which means that in the long run, the taxpayers will pay less in that particular district. Right. So that can be part of it. Yes, ma'am.
But your total here is $154 billion?
Yes, ma'am.
So if indeed this legislative body decided to look at eliminating property taxes and INS was a part of it, we'd be paying off $154 billion in debt?
That is correct, and you are somewhat on the hook for it already because the permanent school fund is a backstop for AAA ratings.
It's a backstop, but it's not paying it off.
That's correct. That is different.
There's a big difference there. Okay. Let's see here. On slide 13, where we're looking at the enrollment growth. First off, let me just ask you, this is an amount of total FSP expenditures. I assume that this makes the assumption that you're not increasing the basic allotment.
Yeah, this is under current law.
Under current law.
Yeah, so we would just project under current law.
We had an appropriations hearing day before yesterday, and the demographer met with us.
Oh, great.
And shared some similar information, like the 4-year-olds going down and then going back up. But he actually shared another chart that showed growth throughout the whole period and indicated that, indeed, school-age population was going to continue to grow just at a slower rate.
I think that is correct, and you'll notice this on the slide before 13 on slide 12. We're getting the same information from the demographer. We use our data source is the state demographer, and then there's a National Center for Education Statistics, which is sort of a federal data source. And so there's this very slight dip, and you can see the way the Y value scale is on slide 12. It's a very slight dip, taking us to 2031, and then steady increase from 2031 thereafter. Because what is happening is this sort of like, think of it as a negative enrollment bubble that just works its way through the system. So the fact that you're seeing population growth in that V on the prior slide, we are projecting to see additional population growth, but that still does mean you have this single class that's got 40,000 fewer kids working its way all the way through for 13 years.
Right. But basically, the chart on 12, it's all basically 5.5.
5.5 million. Yeah, 5.5 million plus or minus.
Yeah. So it's not like some huge decrease.
It's not a decline. We're really not really projecting a decline.
Yeah.
It's growth is stalled for a while this negative enrollment bubble works back, and then we should return to some growth level, probably not what it was in, say, the aughts and the tens, but more than what we're experiencing today.
And to go back a minute for the debt service, I'm looking at something that you gave. I don't know which page this is on. This is something in my packet, but see, where do you have the map? That showed,
slide 8.
Oh, maybe so.
Yeah.
Sorry, I got too many pieces of paper.
one?
Yes. So 148 school districts had no INS taxes. At the other end of the spectrum, 67 school districts had a tax rate of at least 50 cents INS. So I guess what I'm thinking about too here, if we were going to buy some of this down, that means those that have no debt would be contributing to those that do, would it not?
If your policy choice is to begin to buy down INS,
yeah,
you have a lot of I think policy questions to consider if you're getting into building
I agree.
debt.
That's why I'm asking you about this.
Yes, ma'am.
I think those are the policy questions we have to think about. With the compression, do y'all have any estimate of the timeline if we continue on the route we're on now in terms of how far down we're going to go? I mean, are we going to, at one point it was talked about as if we would keep compressing year after year after year after year till where there's no more M&O.
So I think there's two answers to that question. So one is under current law, and then one is what you could hypothetically do. Okay. So under current law, House Bill 3 creates automatic compression after the first 2.5% of value gain.
Right.
So you will continue to get property tax compression, rate compression under House Bill 3 as long as the underlying value growth of the state exceeds 2.5% per year. But that never takes you to zero. Actually, the opposite, because it always allows you to collect slightly more and more property taxes. It'll bring the rate down, but nominal tax payments will still continue to rise. So that's sort of the current law question. The different question is, would you do something like you did with Senate Bill 2 sort of repeatedly for the foreseeable future? And I think that to the extent that you'll have revenues for that and prioritize that, you could. The thing to bear in mind is how much that is in total. So if you just did Tier 1 M&O, just Tier 1, which is not Tier 2 and not INS, that's slide 6. So you're at $25 billion per year. That's not a biennial number. These are per year numbers. So you think about what's your total general revenue available. Do you have payments for roads and healthcare and jails and whatnot? So it's a pretty sizable dollar value.
Okay. And I think I just want to also clarify what you said, because I've heard different numbers out there. You said basically $10,500 per student.
So to give you slightly more information on that, we have our handy-dandy annual report. So hopefully you all have a copy of this in front of you. If you turn your attention to page 4 and 5, this is sort of like a simplistic picture of school finance. The bar on the left shows you the all-in funding per pupil over the last decade or so. And so it was at $15,000 per student in the 21-22 school year. So it's $15,000 per student. So the reason you're always going to hear different answers to this question, this is worth saying, is because it always kind of depends on what's the question you're asking. So if you want to know how much
and what you're including in the answer.
That's exactly
Yes.
right. So if you want to know how much money school districts have in their budgets, it's $15,000 per kid on average. Now that's not actually the same in any district because there's a variety of reasons districts have different budgets, but that's your average for school districts. Then again, which part of this question you're asking, what are you including? If you go to the right-hand side, we try to provide some at least simplistic way of slicing this up in ways that it is commonly sliced up. So the kind of dark green, tealish color, that's what we would refer to as M&O. But M&O is quite complicated because a lot of it depends even on the pieces of M&O you want to count. Do you want to count Tier 1 only? Do you want to count Tier 2? There's a $2 billion payment per year made by the legislature to school districts that's completely off budget, and that's to pay their payroll taxes for TRS obligations. So that's also part of your entitlement. So anyways, that's the number that's about 10,500. That's your 10.35, and it's then the on that particular bar chart, the INS is about $1,700 per kid. But again, back to the stat you just cited, with 160 districts that are zero, so that's literally zero for them. It's also zero for all the charters. They don't get that. Then the light blue color is federal funding. That is unusually high in this year. It's unusually high up until the year we just finished, by about $1,000 a kid, because we got, for about 3 years, we got one-time extra money for COVID, which is about $1,000 a kid in federal funding formulas. So you should expect that light blue number to come down by about $1,000 when you're projecting it forward. And then the purple's sort of miscellaneous. But that's why it's always complex to give you an answer to the question, because it really kind of depends on what you're asking.
Right. And certainly looking at the chart, even on the left, you can see the significant bump in federal dollars, which we know is not coming back. And
That's correct.
Now going away. So I just think thank you for that. I think it's important that we clarify that, and hopefully we can all get on the same page about what the numbers are that we're talking about. Because it depends on which chart you use.
That's exactly right.
And which another thing I wanted to ask you about and point out from something that y'all had in, I think it was in the fiscal size up, but it was the chart that came from TEA that showed that special education students over the past, since 2018, have gone up 41%.
Yeah, there's a version of that actually on the very next page of this too. It's not the same thing, but there's a version of that on page 7 of the annual report, the blue bar graph.
Yes.
You'll see that as recently as 2017, only about 9% of kids in the state of Texas were identified as students with disabilities receiving special education supports. And as of the 22-23 year, that was 13%. It's actually 14% as we sit in this committee hearing. Is actually above 14% now. So a very significant growth in the number of students that were both identified and now receiving special education services in public schools in Texas. We've added more kids to be identified and getting services to special education in the last 5 years than half the states have total kids. So it's been a very big
There are
increase.
some reasons for that, one of which was the unofficial cap that had been applied for several years, 8.5% or whatever the heck it was, that we stopped using.
I think the way that I would characterize it is we are much better now at evaluating students who are in need of special education supports and entitled to them than we used to be.
So this is not a bump because people are erroneously identifying these special needs students. It's because we have done a better job of identifying.
I think there's some growth in the autism population. So if you think about demographic change, there is some underlying growth in the autism population. And there likely is some growth in the specific learning disability population. But other than that, it's actually just these kids were there before we had not identified them. It's not like a demographic change.
And the cost of those students, there is an additional cost depending on what the services are that they require. Do you have something in your book about that?
Well, this slide before, back to that super pie chart thing on slide 5. Just there's one of those little pie slices you see on the right is special education funding from the state. So we don't get any more funding from the feds. They give us about it's like 14 to 17% of our special education, and we get the same amount of money, whatever. But the foundation school program is based upon identification. So as more kids are identified, more money goes to school districts underneath that special education funding formula of the state.
So that 10,500 is inclusive of that?
That is.
So that means that those students who have complicated medical situations and are costing...
So so there are students in the state of Texas that their particular entitlement can crest $30,000 per year.
I have heard of larger numbers than that.
There are students that can cost $200,000 a year. But entitlement and cost are not the same thing. There was y'all meaning the Texas legislature, convened a special education finance commission about 2 years ago, made a series of recommendations, which wholeheartedly y'all should do them. And one of them was to restructure the special education formulas to better match revenue to a school district tied to required expenditures in special education. Right now there's asymmetry between the amount of money that you can collect and then the amount of money that you have to spend for the same child.
Yeah, I think their total was something like 2.1 billion gap.
The best evidence that we have is the current gap between all special education spending, which is generally required, and all dedicated special education revenue from state and local or state and federal sources is $1.7 billion per year.
I think that backed out SHARS.
That is with the reduction of SHARS. Because so before SHARS was reduced, it would have been $1.3 billion per year.
Okay.
Because SHARS is largely a reimbursement program for special education.
Yeah.
It's that's the best way that I can think about SHARS.
We had that on Tuesday.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yes.
You guys are.
So my last point here, in terms of the cost per pupil, if you're including in that students whose cost is significantly higher than most other students, does that skew that average number?
I don't know that I understand the question. Let me answer your question in this way. I think you would be wise to try to address that funding gap in special education.
Okay, fair. Thank you.
To recognize Representative Noble.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Circling back to our purpose today, and that is property tax relief. I just really want to get a handle on the gaps in public education funding. So I'm looking at page 10 in particular of your handout, where you're saying that 1% of attendance rates. We're not giving schools $380 million for 1%, but you were saying earlier, did I hear correctly, that it's about 1.7? Is that correct or not? You said an average student is missing 1.7.
If you are absent for 1% of the school year, you miss 1.7 days.
Oh, okay.
But if there is a decline in attendance rates of 1% statewide, that means that school districts receive roughly $380 million less in funding.
So we need, as we're looking at funding for our school districts, we need to not count that as money that the state has in our reserves. We need to look at how we make sure that they're whole, because they still have to have those seats available, and teachers still have to be in the front of the room, even if children are not showing up 1.7
Yeah,
days.
I would certainly recommend that at least that $380 million number per year be something that you consider as an increase in the formulas in some
Well, it's not an increase because that's money that we've allotted. It's just not being realized since COVID changed kind of the attendance pattern. Is that kind of accurate?
I think that's a way to characterize it.
Okay, and so I mean I have both declining school districts and school districts that are having. I had one school district build 2 new schools this year, and so it's really apples and oranges. But when you get down to it, they still have to have those seats available for children.
Ma'am. That's correct.
And so, and how do we make sure that they're not going in the hole over having to have those seats?
Yeah, as just as a broad FYI, parts of the school finance system are driven by daily attendance. Parts of them are not. So, for example, funding for low-income kids in the Foundation School Program is something we call a compensatory education allotment. That is enrollment-based. Kid shows up on October 30th, you get $2,000. End of discussion. So, if you were concerned about funding just on an enrollment basis, you could potentially modify the funding formulas to increase the comp ed allotment.
Okay, thank you. And so when we get back to it, we do have some additional money as a state, and how we pass that savings back to the taxpayers, because that is their money, it's not ours, I think that we just always need to keep in mind that we do need to make sure that everyone's whole from formulas that may be outdated.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Representative Turner and then Vice Chair Theory, because Commissioner Morath is apparently more popular than Comptroller Hager.
I'm wearing a tie.
He definitely is. Yeah. Thank you, Commissioner. I sort of see you over there. Hopefully you can hear me. So you heard the conversation I had with the controller a little while ago. So picking up there, his office does the property value study, and then when they find districts that are under or over in terms of their appraisal value, that information then gets forwarded on to TEA. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. So then once it's in your hands, what happens from there if you've got a district? Let's say that his study has shown that the local property valuation is less than what it should be.
Yeah. If you'll permit me, I'll go from 30,000 feet down just
Great.
to kind of explain the policy mechanism. So in Tier 1, y'all set the maximum tax rate that a school board can set, which is, again, I think in the mid 60s or something right now. But you do not actually set local taxes. The school board decides to set tax rates. A school board can choose to go lower than that maximum compression. And if they do that, the way that the statute works is that just reduces their per child entitlement under the Foundation School Program. So if you think the average M&O entitlement's 10.5, and you set at what's called MCR, that maximum rate, you get the 10.5 per kid. Doesn't matter what your taxes are, you get 10.5 per kid because the state makes up the difference or recapture kicks in. And if you decide to go lower than that tax rate, you just as a local body, very fiscally conservative, I want to set it locally, then that might lower your entitlement to $10,000 per kid instead of 10.5 per kid. That's sort of the basic policy framework of the Foundation School Program. If appraised values come in materially lower than, say, what the market would bear, it is effectively as if the local school board decided to lower those tax rates. Now, the local school board's not deciding to do this. This is what the appraisal district is doing. But functionally, that's exactly what's happening. So what y'all have crafted in terms of the statutory framework for us is school districts are allowed plus or minus 5%, no questions asked. If you're plus or minus 5%, between 5 and 10%, then you get 2 years of that where the local school district's supposed to work with their appraised district, try to get that appraised value corrected, because let's say they're lower. What that means is they're kind of below the maximum tax rate, and therefore they should not be getting entitlement. But they continue to get entitlement per kid in their budget for 2 more years. And then after the 2 years, we assume that the values that you should have collected taxes are what the comptroller tells us, not what you're actually valued. And that causes a pretty big swing in a district's budget, because now we're sort of lowering their entitlement as a sort of a function of law, because what they have done is they've lowered taxes in their one jurisdiction different than everybody else. Now, the school board's generally not doing this intentionally. It's happening because of what they appraised, but this is sort of the function of law. And I mentioned that plus or minus 5% and then the 2-year grace. Let's say you were at 4% and the very next year you're at 11%. If you're above 10% out of range, there is no grace, it's immediate. And so since I have been here, there have been a small number of counties and then the school districts in those counties that are on what we call state values for some time because they've been out of whack. What happened during COVID is property values went through the roof for any number of reasons, and a lot larger number of appraisal districts got out of whack with market appraisals based upon the comptroller's value study. So this problem reared its head at a much larger scale than ever had been true in the state. Some of those counties have now corrected their appraisal settings, and so they're back to normal, but others are still out of bounds. So I think you're in Tarrant County, we're generally aware of what's happening. And what could be the downstream effect is if they get out of value by more than 10%, all those school districts will lose instead of being entitled to 10.5 per kid, it'll come down to whatever it was based upon how far below appraisal sort of market they are based on what the comptroller tells us. So hopefully that answered your question, but that was sort of the framing.
No, I really appreciate it. It's a great description. And so, to be clear, that is not discretionary on TEA's part. That is statute. You're just following the law. That's what the law says, and that's what you have to do.
Yep.
Okay. And so, in the event that a district was out of range by 10% or more, which, from what I understand, is likely to happen in Tarrant County within the next couple of years, if the appraisal district plan stays in place, then they would go from 10.5 per student
to something less,
and that would just depend.
Depends on how far.
Is there
out
a way
of
to forecast that?
We can model a whole bunch of different scenarios. Knowing those CFOs up there, they're already modeling those scenarios and they're communicating that to the appraisal district.
Okay. Has TEA done? You're aware of the situation. Have y'all done any kind of study or modeling on the Tarrant situation?
No.
Okay. It's fair to say that it would. I forget how many school districts we have in Tarrant County, but it's dozens. So this would affect a lot of districts and a lot of kids.
The numbers that I have read that they have publicized are certainly well within the realm of reality.
That they have.
That the school districts have projected. Those numbers certainly are very plausible, depending on exactly how this turns out.
So it's and what I've read is they've projected millions in losses per school year. So that seems realistic.
It's certainly plausible. You think about the size of Tarrant County, and if the entire county is out of balance. And as one thing to point out, as the comptroller mentioned, this is an every other year study until you're out of balance, and then it's an every year thing. So half of them might have the shoe drop 1 year after the other half, but the shoe will drop.
Okay. Do you have recommendations on recourse to? Because as the controller and I talked about, it's the school district is kind of the middleman here, right? I mean, or a bystander almost. It's like the appraisal district is taking an action that affects them, which then causes the state to take an action. The school district doesn't really have leverage in this situation.
Yeah, I think there's a number of policy choices that y'all could consider. The one, and I'm happy to brainstorm with your office on those.
Thank you.
One is how do you want to address the budgetary impact in a school district? Mm-hmm. And two is how do you want to change or adjust the incentive system, the incentive structures in the system related to this dilemma. When I think about this issue broadly, and I think it's back to your question about appraised values going up. If appraised values go up for a taxing jurisdiction in a major way, the local city and county can lower tax rates and therefore not collect any more net value from the aggregate of their taxpayers. In school finance land, we automatically allow for the first 2.5% and then compress after that, which means that from a school finance perspective, that does mean that 2.5% increase in total tax payments in that jurisdiction. And so you could potentially address the school finance conundrum to say change that 2.5 to 0 or something like that. but it's also going to be felt differently by different taxpayers inside the jurisdiction. We look at the jurisdiction's total, not taxpayer owner parcel by parcel. So one owner sees a 20%, homeowners are capped at 10%, but sees a huge increase in appraisal. Another one, a slight decline for any number of reasons. It balances out, and you can say, well, there's no new tax collection for the jurisdiction as a whole, but that's going to be experienced differently by different taxpayers inside that jurisdiction. So I think these are, really complex questions that you have writ large about state policy and how you want that to work. But as the comptroller pointed out, this appraisal conundrum in Tarrant County is unique in how it affects school districts because of the interplay of entitlement and what is expected to be collected. Because if values are much, much lower from an appraised perspective than a market perspective, and the county is trying to run itself, it can just raise rates and still collect the exact same total amount of taxes that it did before. School districts do not have that option. The school finance system controls their maximum taxing, and again, they set at maximum taxing to get their entitlement. No more, no less. It's an issue that I don't think there are great solutions for. One, again, I think from a governance perspective, happy to brainstorm with you about kind of different policy considerations.
Thank you. And that's a great point. I appreciate you raising that. Because this policy change in Tarrant County, it does affect cities, does affect counties, every other taxing jurisdiction, but they have recourse to
they have tools.
We have, the 3.5% cap, I guess,
on the known revenue rate.
On new revenue, yeah. And so they can just simply raise their rate to capture the same amount of revenue. School districts do not have that option.
That's correct.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Then shifting gears just quickly, because I wanted to follow up on Representative Howard and Representative Button's conversation with you just on terms of overall funding for our public schools, because it's so interrelated with property taxes in this state. On the chart on the report that you were referring to earlier, this one on page 4.
Oh, thank you.
This one here.
The annual report chart?
Yep, that one. Okay. Make sure we're looking at the same thing. So it does show for 21-22 that increase, or the total of $14,928 per student. So as Representative Howard discussed, that increase there appears to be largely in the federal funding category.
Yeah, that's right.
You explained that was the ESSER funding. Yeah. So if we look at just state funding, the blue and the gray portion of the bar, that appears to be pretty flat from 2019 to present. Am I seeing that correctly?
I would say I would asterisk your present. It's
okay.
Flat to the last time period in the graph.
Thank you. Yes, that is more accurate to say.
The most recent year, there were some significant infusions of resources for public education writ large. Total spend is up about $2 billion, and then also a very significant shift between local and state. Less local, more state. Some of that you can see that sort of horizontal bar down at the bottom. So again, as a function of law, Tier 2 enrichment has an inflationary factor in law. So entitlement of golden pennies went up to the tune of about $1.2 billion per year of total funding in district budgets. And then you also had the school safety bill, which gave them more resources, and a instructional materials bill that gave them more resources. So that was about $2 billion in total. Not to be confused with the $2 billion per year that was also a contingency rider that did not actually get released. So there was a lot of news stories that were like, there's no new money for public education. Those news stories weren't accurate. That $2 billion didn't get released, but the other $2 billion did.
There's $2 billion total released or increase as a result of actions in the last session.
That's correct.
And that was per year or per biennium?
Per year.
Per year, okay, thank you. All right. So this chart also, though, is we look at the increase in funding from where it starts in 2010 to present, these are real dollars, right? These are not inflation-adjusted dollars, right?
That is right. We provide y'all a financial transparency report. I think might have been Representative Howard's brainchild as a rider report. So we have a kind of a CPI-based number for you that's public. I don't know that I have it here, but you should have access to that, and we're happy to share it with your office.
Okay, great, thank you. I assume if we had that, or if we're looking at inflation-adjusted dollars, we would see an actual decrease in funding, at least from, say, 2019 when we passed House Bill 3?
I don't think you see the decrease yet, but you will at some point, because it's a function of which year we're talking about, also the baseline for CPI. I'm trying to pull up a copy of this thing. This is generally, it's we call it like the Rider 60 report. I can't remember exactly what this thing is, but if you give me just a second, I'm going to try to find that.
Okay.
There's a, did we give them copies of this? No? Okay. We'll email it to your office. There's
Thank you.
And what is generally true is we kept pace with inflation when looking at all funds, at least through the 21-22 school year. I also think potentially the 22-23 school year. But after that, because of the significant levels of inflation, we began to cede ground when looking at total funds.
Okay, so for the present, that'd be, well, so I guess we just finished the 23-24 school. So starting the 23-24 school year and now into the 24-25 school year, would it be accurate to say that total funding is, adjusted for inflation, has less value than funding in 2019-2020?
Yeah, for 24-25, so the school year we're sitting in right now that's just starting, that all of the one-time ESSER money is done. So, and that was about $1,000 per kid. So on average, $1,000 per kid reduction in school district budgets due to the fact that they received this one-time money from the feds and then they stopped. And so districts used that kind of 3-year $1,000 per kid in different ways, and it wasn't actually $1,000 per kid in every district. Everything's complicated in school finance land, but the that money is not there anymore.
Right.
And to the extent that districts use that for one-time payments, no muss, no fuss. But to the extent that they used any of that for ongoing expenditures, including to address any inflationary costs inside their district, this is where you see districts now adopting some deficit budgets because they no longer had that extra money from the federal government. Now, even though your spending has in fact continued to increase, the spending authorized by the legislature.
Right. Okay. But I understand. So districts were, fortunately had the ESSER funding available to either cover one-time expenses and or cover some ongoing expenses temporarily. That's done with. That's over. And so now with the combination of inflation and while there has been some additional state funding, before, $2 billion a year you mentioned from the last session in different pots, with the lack of overall, not specifically a basic allotment, lack of a basic allotment increase, it's fair to say districts have less buying power with the dollars they have than they had a few years ago.
Yeah, and I need to wait until we have official data to tell you exactly how it breaks down. A lot of this stuff also depends on which bucket of money you're talking about. Do you want to track this number excluding all federal funds, which we can do. We can run analysis that's just FSP entitlement by the state, or do you want to include INS? Do you not want to include INS? So I think you actually get different answers to the question depending upon what set of funds that you're looking at. I as a former school board member, it was much less important what tax policy decision was made to give me the budget to spend. This was the budget that I had, and in the year that we're starting, there's $1,000 less dollars because of $1,000 less dollars per kid being provided by the federal government.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And I would just add too, certainly in my area, and I'm sure this is true, obviously, a lot of districts have dipped into their fund balance to cover their current budget, but they're probably not going to have that option going forward.
Yeah. This is a complex story. This was a recommendation we were encouraging school districts to do. So the one-time ESSER money was very unusual. I think I heard somebody mention the state using it for TJJD or something like that, or T something. Sorry, that's outside of my area. But you were allowed, the state, we were allowed collectively to use it to supplant. It was not required to be supplement. And so we provided sort of accounting guidance to school districts that said, if you think about capacity investments that you want to make long term, you may actually be better off using the federal money to cover what you normally would cover with state expenses, adding to your fund balance with then the savings, and creating a longer glide path, which would then intentionally mean you were supposed to be dipping into your fund balance, sort of like it's not a bug, it's a feature, to make 3 years worth of money last 6 or something like that. There's still an end point to that, but some of that was actually intentionally planned.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Chair recognizes Vice Chair Theory.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Commissioner. I'm going to get back to a little bit of the enrollment attendance discussion you had. So this past session, there was some discussion about, as we were addressing property tax relief, there was this discussion also about moving to a enrollment-based formula entirely versus attendance. But now I'm hearing kind of based on this cultural shift you've talked about, where obviously attendance is going down too, but enrollment overall, because apparently there's less kids or less children, is down as well. What would be the impact, what if you have the hypothetical of that, if we had just gone to completely enrollment-based, even perhaps this session, looking at the very next biennium?
It is a great and I will say, from my perspective, somewhat misunderstood policy question, because the one thing that was true before COVID and one thing that actually generally continues to be true now is the state of Texas is one of about 7 states that has an attendance-based funding formula, and we have some of the lowest rates of chronic absenteeism of any state in the country. We have some of the highest student attendance rates in the country, and those are not unrelated facts. The system creates an incentive for school system leaders to ensure that kids are in school every single day. That is a very, very good thing, and it is a disproportionately good thing for the most at-risk kids. And if you switch to an enrollment-based funding system, you will no longer have that incentive. And I think it is a logical conclusion that for policymakers to make, is that your at-risk kids will disproportionately suffer from that because they will see lower attendance rates long term. So the question is, how can you provide more budget stability to districts, which is what they rightfully want?
Right, and before, I'm sorry to interrupt you on that. As you expound on that, I wanted you to also factor in this kind of baseline you said for lower income communities that have, or districts that have, I think you said an automatic allotment per child based on enrollment. That I did not. I'm embarrassed to say I did not know that. And so if you could factor that into the conversation.
To some extent, you can kind of have the best of both worlds in Texas because I think of wise policymaking decisions the legislature has made before. You have part of the school finance system that's attendance-based. And that is an important incentive to keep if you want to have ensure that kids attend at higher rates, and that's generally a good thing. Kids that go to school more often learn more. But you also need to have part of the system based upon enrollment, because that provides the most funding stability for districts. So if you want to keep the best of both things, and you want to address, say, this $380 million decline, you could put all of that into a part of the formulas that is enrollment-based, not attendance-based. And what that would mean is you wouldn't put it in the basic allotment, you would put it in the comp ed allotment. And this is, I think, a choice that you have as policymakers.
Okay, so I think for those at home listening, it's a very nuanced analysis and discussion. So if you said that's one way we could approach it, what percentage, just for the most basic person trying to understand what it is we're doing here, what percentage of our overall budget goes to pub ed? Well, how much went to it this past session?
It's generally 40? The largest percentage, but you're asking me a question about your overall budget, and I'm not an expert on your overall budget.
It's usually over 40%. in your experience, does that increase? Has that increased each session?
Since I've been around, the number one spending area of the Texas legislature has been public education consistently. If you think about that exact percentage is not something that I specifically track.
What I'm trying to get to is, it seems like no matter what we're doing, we're back to the same conversation about the public schools not being fully funded. But from today's discussion, it sounds like it's not just the basic child per allotment discussion. It has a lot more to do with other areas where the money is going, would you say? Because if we look at the budget and we look at what we have, and you're saying we've increased that over time, we're not entirely attendance-based, we're not entirely enrollment-based. So as you said, we have the best of both worlds there. I'm trying to get to what is it that we're here today trying to say, well, how can we have sustainable property tax relief, so that these conversations are not always competitive. Right. As though we can't, if we do that, if we help families in that way, we're hurting families in another way, which we have the job to say, well, no, we're trying to do the best of both worlds. If the percentage has increased every session, and we have the best of the enrollment and the attendance, and I know this may be kind of a hard question for you to answer, what is it that you think is the piece that's missing why we are having these kind of competitive discussions about property tax relief versus pub ed, since they go hand in hand? And that may be more too. I don't want it to be a political answer.
I don't know that you're ever not going to have this as an inherent discussion. As a person who pays taxes, I want to pay the least amount of taxes humanly possible. And then as a person who oversees your public education system, I want to have as many resources as possible for public education. So I think this is the great thing about our Republican form of government. We elect representatives, and y'all duke it out and make that decision. So what I will say is, like, the topic of what is the ideal funding approach for public education, there is no answer for that question. The reason I know that is because the legislature convened a school finance commission for about 1.5 years and analyzed it more thoroughly than it has ever been analyzed before. And there is no magic number. There are a lot of interesting things to be gleaned from discussions about how to fund and how much to fund public education. One of them is on a graph in this same annual report. If you turn to the very last page, I will make you feel proud as a Texan. So on the very last page, page 14, on the bottom of that graph is a map of Texas and a map of New York. Y'all see that? Just fun fact, that's to scale. Just everything is, in fact, bigger than Texas. The two numbers that you see is the per pupil funding provided in Texas, and this is some dated information, so it's lower than where we are now, and the per pupil funding in New York. You see right off the bat, New York is spending a lot more per child than Texas is. But the numbers over to the right are who has better student outcomes for 4th and 8th graders. And everywhere you see a Texas flag, we have higher outcomes than New York. And everywhere you see the Empire State outline, New York's beating us. So your system of public education in Texas is vastly more effective than New York's for half the money. And so this is one of the very complex questions about how much to spend on public education. There was a research report came out a month and a half ago looking at ESSER funding infusions. That research report found a very consistent effect with prior research on funding infusions in public education. And it found for every $1,000 per kid of extra money that is put inside the public education system, inside of any district, inside of any school, it is worth about 6 extra days of instruction in reading and 10 extra days of instruction in math, or vice versa. That's what they found. So is it true to say money doesn't matter? No, it's not true to say that money doesn't matter. But to put that days of impact in perspective, the decline in student proficiency caused by COVID was 4.8 months, not 4 days, not 8 days. So it almost always comes down to discussions about how to invest additional resources in ways that will likely return the most bang for the buck for our kids in the context of public education.
Thank you.
Chair recognizes Ms. Johnson.
Thank you. Commissioner, thank you very much for this presentation. Going to charts 6 and 7, something that I had suspected as a county tax collector is I was seeing the phenomenon in Galveston County where as the legislature was compressing tax rates, my school districts were increasing their debt rate. And it was a sad sight to see because I knew that my taxpayers were going to be very upset because they were not going to see the benefit of any of the efforts of this body, and that was a hard thing to deal with. And of course, Facebook, definitely, they all lit it up. Where's our tax relief? Well, the tax relief got eaten up by debt. And these are two very, very good charts to show that. So thank you, very succinct. Going to the chart on 15, you give 3 different how to provide additional tax relief. And and this is somewhat editorializing, but I'll get to the point. So the first point is compressing the M&O 10 cents. That would essentially benefit every taxpayer. Where if you expand the homestead exemption, you're going to benefit some. Now, some will say homeowners are more important than anybody else. I can't say that I agree with that. I think all businesses own a home, so I think that there's going to be a mutual benefit. Everybody will benefit. The thing that I'm really have a concern about is providing a universal 20% homestead. I would not be in politics today had it not been for the elimination of the county education districts, which eliminated the 20% homestead exemption across the state of Texas. That massively pushed a lot of people's taxes up when that was eliminated. So, but my concern with this concept today is with 199 school districts having a local option and 2 of them in my county, and they are recapture districts, I'm concerned for those property owners that if this was an option that the legislature chooses, would there be any benefit to those property owners? No, so they would see nothing. So in Galveston ISD and Texas City ISD, there would be absolutely no benefit on that option.
And I think you're spot on. And so the question is if you want to deal with this conundrum in the school finance formulas, you do have to think about that problem. And it may be a multi-year solution, it may be phased in, it may be part of other tax relief. You could do ancillary changes in the school finance system for it too, and where you just don't, you create a state funding vehicle for this as other people come up. So I think there's a number of choices, but you are correct. Each one of those vertical bars represents different winners. Nobody's a loser, but it represents a different population of winners. Each one of those bars does.
Okay, thank you. And I've got 2 totally different sets of questions. One is on page 17, you have you're talking about consideration, limiting growth, and I'm talking about the 2.5% here.
Yes.
I'm in the middle right now of assessment, so we're doing truth and taxation, which is anything but truthful, to be perfectly honest with you. It looks like an IRS tax form, and we're doing pluses and minuses. It's a ridiculous form almost. And trying to explain it to people is very painful. Trying to explain it to elected officials is even worse. But if for school districts, and I had a legislator had called my office, a state senator had actually called my office and said, well, where's the 2.5% for the school districts? And I couldn't find it in the forms. And I realized it's because it's in the school funding formula. So it's in the rate that we receive as counties in order to do those calculations. So for a school district, it's the ISDs, it's the M&O rate that's calculated with the 2.5% automatically in there, plus the debt gives your voter approval rate. Where for every other government, it is nearly every other government, the voter approval rate is the adjusted M&O plus the 3.5% or their 8% or whatever that percentage is, plus their debt gives you the voter approval rate. If the legislature was to take that 2.5% out of the automatic and make it an openly and transparent 2.5% on that form, might that be something?
At least
do you
people
believe
would
that would be
understand
more
it's happening.
transparent?
Yeah. But, I mean, I've also read my truth and taxation form as a homeowner, and I feel like I know a little more than the average homeowner about the way all this works, and it's generally unintelligible. I do think that the way that we communicate about property tax decisions probably needs to be fundamentally different for ISDs and every other taxing jurisdiction. Because every other taxing jurisdiction, it works one way, and ISDs, it works a completely different way. So, like, you might even split the form up and say, this is what's happening with everybody else, and by the way, this is what's happening in school finance land.
And it may or may not make this elected body feel better about it, but what I'm seeing is the new devil is going to be your mud districts. I had two that just adopted $1.15 tax rates, and there's no exemptions whatsoever. And so they are far exceeding the rates of the school districts right now. They're going to be the new problem. And then looking in your book, so I was on a school board many years ago. That got me started. But where in here, or is it anywhere, do the fund balances for these school districts ever factor into the calculations at all? I know we used to say 3 or 4 months is what we should keep an INS and M&O, but that was like the taxpayers' money that we're taking. We're saving for a rainy day, but is that growing tremendously? Is there any control over that? And is that something that y'all even look at all or maintain the records of?
So we keep track of all the fund balance information in all fund categories. So there's M&O fund balance and INS fund balance. Kudos to you. Very few people even realize there's an INS fund balance. So the fund balance has grown. Are we at 24? What are we, Amy? Is it 24 billion, 22 billion, something like that?
Almost there. It's up to 24.
So we're at $24 billion in M&O, just the M&O fund balance, aggregate for all school districts in the state.
Isn't that the same thing as the state rainy day fund?
I can't remember exactly what the comptroller said, but it's a big number.
That just doesn't sound right.
So to your question, does TEA play a role in this? We do play a role in part. We give everyone an A through F rating for their finances, just like we give them an A through F rating, we're supposed to, for their academics. The A through F rating in the finances is based upon a series of calculations. One of those is we say the expectation is 90 days worth of cash in your fund balance. So some districts are there, some districts are way above it, some districts are below it. There are actually a lot of super logical reasons for a whole bunch of different decisions. We talked about those 166 districts with zero debt. Some of them, it's just like church. They're putting money in the building fund, saving it up, and then they're going to spend $20 million on a new building, and they won't have done it with any debt. In that case, you see like their M&O fund balance like increasing steadily over time for that purpose. In other cases, as I was talking to Representative Turner, we're in a position where for the last 3 years we've recommended districts like squirrel as much away as possible so that you can create a smaller glide path from the fiscal cliff of when no more federal extra money is there. So that's part of it. It's really difficult from my chair to tell you that any one school district that's too much, too little, or just right, because the conditions are variable for the policymakers in that district. And in truth, some of them it is too much, too little, and just right. It's hard to judge that from afar with aggregate data.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. The chair would like to acknowledge Representative Shine.
Thank you for a very engaging conversation on this. This is very complex. I think I've tried to study it as thoroughly as possible, and I always learn something new, and you've certainly helped with that. I've got a couple of questions. The first one, real quick, the truancy that we changed back 10 years ago, any negative impact that you see, how that is on schools as far as attendance is concerned?
What I can tell you is what I hear word of mouth from our school system leaders, and what I hear word of mouth from our school system leaders is it's having a negative effect.
Yeah.
I'm not an expert on that policy area, but I find the arguments very plausible.
I understand. So we talked about full enrollment a moment ago, and I was going to have a question on that, and you answered a lot of that, but I have this question. Is it possible, I know it's already a complex system anyway, but when schools open their doors in the fall semester, they've got to have the buildings, provided for, fixed costs, school buses, transportation, everything else. Is it possible from a fixed cost perspective, if we can't go to the full enrollment side, of being able to provide the cost factor there for those schools so those things are addressed and maintained so that they're not, so they don't suffer losses because of the ADA?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I will say that it is the calculations involved are going to be far more complex given the diversity of the 9,000 campuses in Texas.
Yeah, I figured it was.
You mentioned transportation, for example. That's not universally provided. You've got school systems that don't provide transportation because it's not actually statutorily required, and you get additive funds per mile basically for transportation outside of base funds. That being said, there's precedent for the legislature. If you think, I don't know, about like a funding floor per building, that has been done in the new school safety formulas, where what you do is you give them $10 per ADA on top of $15,000 per building. So I think as policymakers, you have any number of choices to make. All of these have drawbacks. It's not like it's which set of trade-offs you are more interested in making, which set of trade-offs you're less interested in making.
So, last question. I want to make sure I understand this correctly. So on the PVS, if you're outside the band,
property value study,
PVS, yeah, and you're outside the band on the low end, and you lose after 2 years, you're going to lose funding. But we've also heard that when you reach the 2.5% and you're above the 2.5%, you have compression. So if a district loses money because of the PVS and they increase their budget once they reach 2.5%, does compression kick in?
That is a good question. Let me answer as much as I can, and then I might have to phone a friend. The 2.5%, the first part of the 2.5% determination is based upon statewide numbers. So if property values in the state of Texas grew by 3.5%, everybody is going to have MCR, their maximum tier 1 rate, brought down by the equivalent of 1%, right? Because that's the 1% above the first 2.5%.
But you're looking at this from the statewide. I'm looking at it from the particular county.
This way, it's kind of a long answer to your question. So you will get the statewide compression no matter what's happening in your local property tax jurisdiction.
Okay.
When we are determining whether or not your property values are growing faster than the state's, and therefore you're entitled to some additional local compression. Mike, the thing I don't know of is if they're on state values, do we just use state values as the year-over-year basis for that? Yeah. So it's whatever the comptroller calculates. If the PVS has kicked in and you're on state values, that's what we determine to see your year-over-year change. And so if the state value determination showed you faster growth than the state, then you in fact get more rate compression because of that. That brings down your individual MCR. That technically still doesn't have any effect, though, on how that entitlement is calculated in your district, because we already know you're going to collect less than what you're supposed to because you're on state, not local. Okay. And so if you're at the bottom of that 10% band, you're capped at the bottom of that 10% band no matter what. Mm-hmm. So I don't know if I answered your question, but I gave it a stab.
Okay, thank you.
Do members have any other questions? Representative Diallo.
I don't know these new microphones. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. I think I'm thinking about questions in my mind. In these new microphones, the button turns green automatically. I don't know how it does it, but it does it. So it's turned green a couple of times for me, and I think that's something telling me maybe I shouldn't keep this question to myself, as silly as it may be. That said, that lead up, thank you for all this. Thank you for all of this information. And the way that you present it is always digestible at some level, kind of in smaller bites, but digestible.
Thank you.
And your office has been phenomenal in helping us, especially those of us that are newer to this role than others. So thank you for that. what I'd like to understand more, the whole purpose of this is we want to take property tax burden and we want to reduce that for our taxpayers, and we want the state to take a bigger bite out of our pub ed expenses, while at the same time in the middle we have pub ed and we have K through 12 and the costs associated with that and the right costs associated with that. So all that plays into all these variables. When we have compression, and we've seen compression come down from $1 to in the 70 cents, and we talk about it being the maximum rate, and then we talk about school districts adopting a rate. And I just want a little bit of clarity on that for just a minute. So there is a maximum rate in a certain school district, let's call it 72 cents, whatever the number is. 72 cents. If that school district wanted to give additional tax relief, that'd be fine. Its formulaic number per student would go down.
Correct.
If that school district wanted to, you know what, our community, we just really enjoy paying higher taxes. It's what we thrive on, and therefore we'd like for more dollars per student. Let's raise our tax rate. Is that even permitted?
It is permitted to the tune of 17 pennies in what is referred to as Tier 2. About half of them are referred to as golden pennies, half of them are referred to as copper. What the golden penny means is there's no recapture on it. You keep all of it no matter what it is, and it's worth a lot. So if you're a low property value place, it's like, I don't know, $120 per kid or something like that. So it brings you way up. And that's the first 9 pennies, 8 pennies, I can't remember which, and then the next set of pennies, nine pennies, are copper. They are subject to recapture, and their target equalization is lower. So what you see is a lot of places that are high wealth, they'll go to all golden pennies and they'll stop there. They could increase their budget by going into copper pennies. They just don't want to do that deal with their taxpayers, because their taxpayers end up sending money to Austin too. So but once you're at the 17 pennies, you're done.
Right.
That is the actual cap.
Okay, so how many districts do we have at the 17 pennies?
I don't have that off the
Ballpark,
top of my head,
just-
but we don't even have that, like 100 maybe.
Yeah.
Like maybe. There are districts that are at the 17 penny cap. There
Correct.
are. Yeah.
Those districts that wanted to say, we want to provide more funding per student, are they permitted under under HB3 and its successive legislation? Can they if they wanted to? Just a hypothetical question.
Only to build buildings.
Okay. Well, that's INS stuff, right?
That's INS. That's
Okay.
the only thing that they
I'm
can
talking
do.
about just M&O.
No. Once you're at the full Tier 1 and the extra 17 pennies, there are no tax policy ways to drive your funding up. There are operational decisions you can make to drive your funding
I
up.
get it. And that was a long-winded way to ask probably a much simpler question.
Well, it is worth reflecting on the operational ways that you have, because those operational choices, we did a sort of analysis on it. There's another like 5 or 10% possible. So the teacher incentive allotment,
Right.
Things like your outcomes bonus for college career military readiness attainment, things like what we call ADSE, the additional days school year. Those are 3 ways that you can substantively. There's things that you can do in CTE to generate more funding. So there's the legislature has created a variety of funding incentives that are independent of local tax policy choices that can drive district budgets up.
And would the new curriculum be under that umbrella as well? A little bit?
Yes. What you've done is you've created $40 of extra funding that you're entitled to for anything that is high quality that the State Board of Education has approved, and another $20 if you happen to use printed copies of the state-owned SBOE-approved curriculum. So those are those kinds of incentive-based responses that have been built into the school finance system.
One last follow-up. We talked about, and you've talked about, enrollment versus ADA, pluses and minuses. One of the things you said is funding per ADA has one benefit, maybe others, but one significant benefit is our attendance rate is higher than most folks around the country that don't have that.
Mm-hmm.
Is there some third-party data or something that we can look at to see something that's kind of looked at
That
issue.
shows that?
Yeah.
Yeah, there, we can give you basically some charts that show our chronic absenteeism rate over a number of years, and then other states' chronic absenteeism. To be honest, I'm a little frustrated because with all the education research that's done, to my knowledge, nobody's actually studied this question in any kind of detail. We can just see that ours is historically lower, and as a school board member, we get former school board members around here. In Dallas, CFO would present and say, if we can get more kids to show up the first 2 weeks of school, it's worth an extra $1.5 million to us. So we would run a huge back-to-school campaign. There's a lot of places in the country where that's not done because it's not worth it financially. So there's a lot of high inference data that we have, but we can show you comparative data across the country.
Yeah, just something, because logically, you think that would be the outcome. I mean, it should be. I would just like,
some evidence,
somebody that says so. So thank you so much.
We'll get you some charts that show the relationship.
Any other questions? Chair calls Rep. Lopez.
Thank you, Chair. I'm glad you have a lot of energy to be here for such a long time, but I appreciate you and all the information that you have provided with us, to us. As we all know, the children are the future. They're going to shape our communities in the future. Public funding obviously is very, very important to us. For my area and my district, I have a very high poverty area. Public schools are the number one for our students in providing an education, which will lead to them getting out of poverty one day. And so the progress that we've made, I feel that is very, very important, but yet there's still a lot more that needs to be done. In high poverty areas like mine, our schools are inadequately funded because we don't have the tax base that other cities do. We have median income values of $20K in a single income household. Our property values median is $100K, $100,000. And so we don't get the tax revenues that other areas might get. And so in my district, it's causing an issue with lack of materials or essential support services that our school district need. And here's the challenge to us. In the state, we must figure out a way to balance this. How does the state help our schools with the funding that we provide as a state, and at the same time provide that relief that my families need also? And so I really appreciate the solutions that you have brought to the table today, that we can look at and consider to see what we can do to further provide some tax relief for our families, which in turn will help our families be able to put food on their table and meet the basic needs that they have, while at the same time providing the funding that our staff and our teachers need as well. So I appreciate all this information that you have brought to us, as our families do deserve that financial relief, but also making sure that our schools have the appropriate materials that they need is very important to me. I do have one question, though, on the information that you provided to us on the comparing New York and Texas. So those numbers were very astonishing, and I started doing a little bit of research. Do you know what the student population is in Texas?
5.5 million. Are you talking about the demographic mix?
Yes. And what about in New York?
In New York, so they're smaller than we are. I don't have their demographic data off the top of my head. I can get it. Texas is basically the most diverse state in the country, or top three. But we also have about 61% of our kids are low income, so unusually high relative to the rest of the country. So I think we tend to have a higher low income percentage than they do. We tend to have a higher English learner percentage, based kids who don't speak English at home, than they do. We have certainly the racial mix. We have a higher Hispanic population than they do, and then we've got more kids than they do by probably a couple million.
Which you described my area, my district. Definitely the high poverty, the families also, the population compared to New York, the information that I found, we have 5.5 billion students. They have 2.4.
Yeah, so we have 3 million more kids than they do, so everything's bigger in Texas.
Yeah, and so I could see why they get more funding too. That doesn't mean I'm saying we don't need more funding, we do. But also, you made another important point earlier too. The population is decreasing. The number of students in our schools are decreasing because in my area, just to give you a little bit of perspective, our families were agriculture families. And so the more kids the families had, the more help they would get in the agriculture. And so families used to have 10 kids, 12 kids. Mm-hmm. My parents had 9. My grandma had 12. And so now families are having maybe 1 or 2 kids. And some families are deciding, let's not have kids right now until 5 years from now, let's just have a dog, or a pet. But it's interesting how all of that is affecting our school system and the finances that we need to maintain the schools. But again, I appreciate all the hard work. I appreciate all the data you've provided to us, and it's certainly information that we need to be looking at to figure out what we can do about school funding and getting that financial relief for our families.
One thing I think is worth pointing out, if it is worth sort of thinking about M&O and INS a little bit differently. As a result of what House Bill 3 was passed by this legislature in 2019, there is almost no impact in a school district's operational budget based upon property wealth. You can be in the most property poor portion of the state. You can be in the most property wealthy portion of the state, and the kids all generate the same amount of money based upon the student need. The state of Texas has quite possibly the single most equitable school finance system in the country with regard to underlying property wealth. This did not used to be true in Texas. It used to be much more dependent upon property wealth than it is now. But kids are worth the same, basically regardless of the geography that they live in terms of the underlying property wealth. That is generally true. There's some asterisks to that, but that is generally true on the M&O side of finance. It is not true at all on the INS side. And so you do see significant differences in building quality based upon local property values. But in terms of the amount of money being spent inside those buildings each year, that is pretty consistent, and it's driven by the way the school finance formulas work based upon matching need with money. So that's, again, this is not all that well understood, but this was a pretty substantive reform by this body in 2019 in House Bill 3 to create one of the most equalized funding systems based upon underlying property wealth that you have in the United States.
Rep. Lopez, does that answer your question? Okay, members, any other questions? Before you go, Commissioner, I had one last inquiry. Back to the attendance funding. I wanted to ask, what are the TEA rules, if any, or even legislative rules, with respect to the administrators sending out information to parents regarding the importance of attendance? Is that just kind of discretionary per district, per school? Because I just kind of give a little point of personal privilege here. My daughter went to River Oaks Elementary last year, and but for me being a state rep, I would not have felt guilty on the days that she didn't go to school. I wouldn't have felt like I'm taken away from the funding for the school. However, on the few days she got strep throat once, she was out actually maybe the whole week. And I remember by the 3rd day, I got multiple text messages from the school asking me, and they were asking me, like, if I have a problem, if I need help, they're there for me, like, kind of like if I was a truant parent. And I talked about it with other parents who had kids that went to school on the other side of town. Now, this school is a top-rated, she was in the IB program, gifted, talented school in a wealthier district. I didn't live there, but she was admitted there based on her designation as gifted and talented. I'm wondering now, what are the requirements, if any, for administrators to notify parents of such? Because I kind of think about it, and I can imagine that most parents, don't know that if they let their child stay out a week or 3 days, that they're taking away funding. And even in the areas where I've seen parents, again at her school, who were wealthier, and so to your point, culturally, they would travel sometimes the whole week before Christmas break or holiday break, as they call it now. They would say, Claire would come home and she said, my best friend, she's going to be out 2 weeks. They're going out of the country. I don't know that the parents even consider, if multiple parents are doing that all around the state, that they're not really probably considering that they're harming the school. So I guess my question is there a requirement that the schools themselves notify parents that their funding is impacted by attendance?
No, we don't have any requirement to notify of that. And I think different campuses and different districts have different postures as to how robust their sort of attendance efforts are. We're trying to improve the ability of schools to have access to sort of free and easy to use tooling to make it easier to get kids in school. The money's actually secondary. You need the kids in school to learn. So it's different campuses have different postures on that.
Okay, for sure. So, I guess we don't want to put more onerous requirements on them, but it might be worth looking into in terms of just encouraging them or putting some kind of guidelines out there, because one, as you said, they do need to be there to learn. But I can tell you, as a parent of a former public school kid, I would not have known such but for being a member of the legislature. So having said that, do members have any other questions? Well, Commissioner Morath, thank you. I want to say also you definitely earned your golden pennies today. Thank you.